being a superintendent, maybe even a state superintendent of instruction, kind of the top guru in every state, or even just the local superintendents, school boards, what have you, and all of a sudden being told you got to desegregate your schools when you had for a long period of time. Okay, now with that said, the Supreme Court said, okay, we'll address when right away. And you see your outline is basically Brown versus Board of Education Part 2. And the Supreme Court says, with all deliberate speed. And you kind of scratch your head and say, oh, okay, what does that mean? All deliberate speed. Now, as you can imagine, right, this being a very controversial decision, even though no division among the Supreme Court, they didn't have one either in Brown 2. But the thing to keep in mind is that you had a lot of superintendents, a lot of state superintendents, a lot of governors saying, okay, we're working on it. We're working on it. It's going to take us some time to do this, right, to unravel what we've created by law in terms of segregation, but we're working on it. They were slow, painfully slow. Okay, you probably have seen enough history, read enough history where you've seen situations where President Eisenhower had to send in federal troops. Again, Little Rock, Arkansas, probably being the most noteworthy example. But that wasn't the only circumstance. I mean, these are things that actually did happen. Controversial for sure. Okay, and you had a lot of tension between the federal government and the state governments, right? The federal government, even if maybe you didn't have every member of Congress on board, and maybe you didn't have even President Eisenhower on board, they knew it was important enough that the Supreme Court's decision had to be upheld, and these are things that had to be changed, right? Okay, now you take a look at the Alexander versus Holmes County case, 1969, and there was still this question as to when do we have to do this? And in 1969, the Supreme Court said now. Now you've got to do it. Now, right? Okay. So again, desegregation may take place at once. Okay, so you had the when kind of answered, and it took 15 years, again, between Brown versus Board 1 and the Alexander case in 1969. But you still didn't fix the how part. All right. Now, there were lawsuits all across the country. By the way, not just in the South, certainly in the North. Large cities, even in Ohio and Columbus and Cleveland, were under desegregation orders. Now, functionally what you had, and this is some of the most fascinating stuff, and your superintendent and your principals have all had to be educated on education law. I know that sounds redundant, but to get their master's degrees. They learned that at one point in time, federal judges were more or less running large school districts, right? At least in regard to the desegregation issue, right? That federal judges knew they had to step in and tell superintendents, this is what you had to do, okay? Now, you can imagine, right, some of the turmoil, right, mostly for the wrong reasons, right, but some of the turmoil that a lot of school districts were facing. You had blacks and whites maybe not agreeing on how this should take place, whether it should take place, probably for sure. Okay, so one of the chief remedies, right, you see this in the Swan case, which in many respects is every bit as important as really Brown versus Board, and that sounds maybe a little tough to say, but the impact was amazing. Here in in 1973, the United States Supreme Court upheld busing as a means to desegregate. Okay, so accepting, right, that even if you remove de jure segregation, right, you can't separate communities by law, all right, that you're still going to have impact, all right, based on de facto segregation, all right? Well, how do you get people intermingled and how do you make it equal? Now again, these school districts weren't just going to start building all these buildings, all right? They just weren't going to do it. They weren't going to say, okay, here, previous to Brown versus Board of Education, here are all the really nice Caucasian schools, and then all of a sudden we're just going to make all these schools in the neighborhood communities where African Americans lived nicer, right, overnight. No, they weren't going to do that. It's too expensive. So what they did is said, okay, well, we'll bus kids around. We'll move them out of their communities, and it sounds like I'm saying this in a rough way, and I don't mean to prejudice it at all, but saying, okay, you know what? Caucasian kids, African American kids, they're going to go to school together, and we'll move kids around their neighborhoods, right, out of their neighborhoods into the next neighborhood to do that. So maybe in the not so nice buildings, you're going to have Caucasian and African American kids, and in the nice schools, you're going to have African American and Caucasian kids, right? So everybody's kind of sharing in the good schools and the bad schools, okay? Now the Supreme Court upheld this as a remedy, okay? Now, what I can tell you is, again, this was incredibly controversial, all right, incredibly. So you had all this busing taking place just to make sure that you had diverse populations, and, you know, again, lots of these large districts were under desegregation orders. Federal judges were mandating this stuff. It's just the way to work it. Nobody was going to build all these school buildings and make sure they're all top-notch and really, really equal. It just wasn't going to happen, okay? Now, incredibly controversial, right? And again, just growing up in Columbus, not the district that I grew up in, but I grew up in a small suburban community where, you know, we did a lot of parks and recreation types of activities with kids that were in the Columbus district. And some of the kids that were in my neighborhood, that I would consider my neighborhood, maybe just outside the city limits though, and into Columbus, were bused across town to East High School, and it was controversial. Although, you know, I can honestly tell you, the kids that I was with, they didn't have a problem with it. Maybe their parents did, but they didn't have a problem with it. You know, they had friends at East High School, and it just really wasn't that big of a deal for the kids. You know, the kids kind of figured it out. You know, the parents really were the ones who had the problems. Okay, now, having said that, there was a limitation in the Swan case, is that busing could only be used if at one time de jure segregation was reality, right? If it was pure de facto, right, this is the neighborhood of this group and this is the neighborhood of this group, and that's just kind of where they wound up, you couldn't do it. The problem is the overwhelming majority of these districts really were set up to the point where the law said the African American kids go here and the Caucasian kids go here. Okay, now, as you see, I have a note here. This did lead to what we call in the slang white flight. You had a lot of Caucasian families leaving large cities to go out to the suburbs, all right? And you know, if you think about it, this is kind of what grew the suburbs, grew suburban school districts, and, you know, flat out say, for all really the wrong reasons, right? It was just really, it's like, okay, I don't want my kid going to school with X, so I'm gonna leave the city. I'll go out in the suburbs, which, you know, at the point where maybe more rural areas, or what we actually call exurbs today, and they just build up these massive suburbs. And then, of course, you built freeways out to those suburbs, so people could still live out in the suburbs and then, you know, drive to the downtown areas. And, you know, there's been a lot of really rich social science research on what happened to some of the inner city neighborhoods because of the white flight. And, you know, it's hard to say really where was the right answer there, right? Did we ruin good community-based schools by allowing for busing? But if we hadn't done that, how in the world were we ever going to successfully desegregate schools that were at one time segregated based on de jure segregation based on law? And again, there is really just no right answer. I mean, you know, we all might have our own ideas. I personally don't think you had any other choice. I mean, busing was really the best way to do it. And again, it's not to say it wasn't controversial. I mean, in a perfect world, you really would have had that kind of money where you'd make every school in the district equal. But again, it means something, to make sure that people that don't look the same, don't worship the same, sit next to each other and learn. I've been a huge believer of that, but again, I'm not testing you on what I believe. Okay, now, is there a limitation to busing? And the answer is yes. And you see this in Milliken versus Bradley. This is a case that basically limited the scope of busing, right? Where the Supreme Court said you can't bus kids out of the district into another district and bus those kids back into the other district, all right, to desegregate your schools. Okay, now, separate this from Swan. Swan said within the same district you can move kids around, all right? Kind of blunt way to say it, but within the same district you can move kids around, no problem, easy to do, okay? Now, Milliken versus Bradley says you can't move kids out of one district into the suburban suburban districts and move the suburban kids into the inner city district. Excuse me. Okay, now think of the ramifications of this. I mean, it's pretty powerful stuff. Okay, this was known as the Detroit-only program. The state of Michigan was the only state that, Detroit was the only school district in the state of Michigan where Michigan did this. And they knew, by the way, that the Detroit public schools were heavily segregated, and because of a very quick white flight. And Detroit is one of those examples of a city in the north, and we sometimes forget about, incredibly segregated. And it was just based on neighborhoods and ethnic groups, but it really became a majority-minority city very, very quickly. And again, these huge suburbs grew outside of Detroit in Oakland County, Macomb County, Washtenaw County. So nonetheless, and the state of Michigan says, okay, now wait a minute. Now this isn't good. This isn't good for education, right? So we're going to move kids from the suburbs. We're going to bus them into Detroit, and the kids in Detroit, we're going to bus them out to the suburbs to desegregate, right? And the Supreme Court said, nope, there is a limitation here. You can only do that, only have cross-district busing if it can be shown that the districts were created based on race, right? So you would have to prove, if you will, right, that the Detroit school district was created just based on race, and these suburban districts were based exclusively based on race. Now you can imagine how impossible that would be to prove, right? It's true that the overwhelming majority of school districts mirror some type of other municipal boundary, right? That the Detroit public schools mirror the city of Detroit, all right? Now, by the way, it doesn't have to be that. And some of you probably go to this particular school district, or this is true for anybody who lives in a district where maybe the district goes outside the city boundaries, or the city is cut up in two, or something like that. It happens all the time, especially where I grew up in Columbus. The Columbus City Schools reached out into townships that weren't part of the city of Columbus. You get the idea, all right? But you could only do cross-district busing if you could prove that the school districts were created based on race alone. Now again, that would be almost impossible. Now, was it the reality, however, right, especially because of white flight, that these districts did look like they had been crafted based on race? Absolutely, right? The demographics are there, the numbers are there, overwhelmingly obvious to you. But proving that you created this suburb based on race, and just so happens that district's boundaries overlap that suburban municipal boundaries, it would be almost impossible. Okay, but again, the law was certainly there. So again, a very, very significant limitation. So now, if you put all of this together, right? Again, when you think of segregation, it's probably the best example of equal protection law and how it evolved. It's the best example of a great legal strategy where if we're going to start out with separate but equal, okay, fine, prove it. Show me how it's even viable, okay? Getting all the way to these two cases in the 1970s, which I kind of broadcasted earlier, whereby you have that one limitation of Milliken versus Bradley. And now think about it, however. Now just, on your own, using our social science framework, had Milliken gone the other way, right? Where, yeah, you could move kids in and out of districts, right? Would that have had the impact where taxpayers would say, okay, if we're moving kids all around major metropolitan areas, right, then I guess we really would have to invest and make all these schools top-notch with top teachers, top facilities, top books, libraries, desks, classrooms, things like that. Maybe that might have been really the best way to go. That, the way in which we kind of cured segregation, at least in regard to schools, is we kind of went halfway. Maybe we didn't go all the way, because we still allowed some forms of segregation. We called it de facto segregation because people were, you're free to live wherever you want. I mean, you can move out of the district, all right? But maybe we would really have gotten to the point where we needed to be, and we would have seen that investment if parents would have said, okay, you know, my kid, I don't know where my kid's going to go to school, so whether it's within the suburb I live or back, you know, using Detroit as an example, they're going to get bused back in Detroit. Let's make sure all of these schools are top quality with top quality teachers, libraries, desks, that kind of thing. So materials, resource materials will be interesting. Okay, we'll stop there and we will pick up with public opinion when we get back.